Walking away is much harder than carrying on.
Yeah.
I know, because I've done both. You know, I hadn't stopped since 62 or 3 till 73, on demand or on schedule, continuously. And it was very hard, because one always had that thing, well, one ought to, shouldn't I be going, like quotes to the office or producing something, because therefore I don't exist if my name isn't in the papers, or if I don't have a record out on the charts, or whatever it is, or not seen at the right, or whatever the game is. And I was saying it must be like the guys at 65 who said, somebody comes and goes, your life's over, time for golf. It's self-imposed, yes, but still the feeling was still there. Oh, suddenly there's this whole big space that seems to be unfillable. And of course, naturally it got filled, because that's the law of the universe. Leave a space and something will fill it. And it was filled by a fulfilling experience, to put it in a little cute phrase.
When John and I go out, they would say to John, what are you doing now?
Well, I would say, I'm baking bread, And they say, what are you really doing?
Yeah.
I said, well, I'm looking after the baby. No, but what else do you do?
Yeah.
I said, are you kidding? Bread and babies, as every housewife everywhere knows, is a full-time job. And there ain't no space. And I got into cooking a little, and I used to say to Yoko after I made these loaves, I sort of felt I'd conquered something. And I watched the bread being eaten, and I thought, geez, I don't get a gold record, a knighthood, and nothing, We ended up doing things like bed-ins, and she ended up doing things like pop music, whereas she'd come from this avant-garde field, and I'd come from the straight rock field. Well, the first attempt at our being together and producing things together were like 2 Virgin albums, and the events we did, whether they were bed-ins or posters or whatever the events or films and things we did then, we crossed over into each other's fields, like people do from country to pop. We did it from avant-garde left field, from rock and roll left field. And we tried to find a ground there that was interesting to both of us, and we both got excited and stimulated by each other's experiences. We wanted to know, what could we do together, because we want to be together. We want to work together. We don't want to just be together on weekends. We want to be together and live and work together. We attempted a few times to make music together, but that was a long time ago, and people still had this idea that the Beatles were some kind of sacred thing that shouldn't step outside of its circle. We think that either people have forgotten or they've grown up by now, and we'll make a second foray into that place where she and I are together, and not some wondrous mystic prince from the rock and roll world dabbling with this strange oriental woman, which is what the picture was projected by the press report. Here we are, I'm going to be 40, Sean's going to be 5, isn't it great? We survived, he survived his 5 years, and I'm going to be 40, and life begins at 40, so they promise. I believe it too, because I feel fine, and I'm excited, it's like 21, hitting 21, it's like, wow, what's going to happen,
Glass Onion. John Lennon.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 87 of Glass Onion on John Lennon, and this is All We Are Saying, the 1980 Playboy interviews. Funnily enough, this is actually, if you include the bonus episodes, the 100th episode of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Do you remember that thing I promised I wouldn't mention last time out? Thing is, I'm wondering whether I'm going to limp to 100 normal episodes sometime in the future. So anyway, episode 87. Now I'm recording this in late February, but you're hearing this in March. Sorry about the delay, but I had to get another show out, which I will actually mention later, from one of my other podcasts. The title there, All We Are Saying, refers to the book of the John and Yoko 1980 interviews by David Sheff. But the clip you heard there was from the audio. Now, I was prompted to do this, as I possibly said in the last show as well. The audio for these interviews, about 3 hours, 20 minutes or so, came online in December, and I listened to it all, of course, and I listened to it back again at higher speed in preparation for this. It's in the show notes. I hope you like the insert before the music as well. This actually came when I was listening to the Playboy audio. John said Glass Onion, obviously talking about his song, and a light bulb went off, and I thought, let's see if I can find something where he said his own name. Let's set a little quiz. This is really for the hardcore fans. Where did that clip of John saying his own name come from? If you write in and tell me, I'll be very impressed. glassonionpod@yahoo.com. And what about the on bit in the middle? Anyone like to guess? I'll give you 5 seconds, listeners. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Got it? Yeah, it was from What Goes On, the song from Rubber Soul, sung by Ringo. Great! I'll get to all that in a sec, but I want to talk about something that's somewhat connected to the topic. So Yoko Ono just turned 90, as you will all surely know. While we're on that topic, in fact, George posthumously just turned 80 as well. Those two were great friends, as we know, with green cushions and digestive biscuits, etc. And I finally started reading Madeline Boccaro's book, In Your Mind, The Infinite Universe of Yoko Ono. The subtitle there refers to the album, Approximately Infinite Universe. Very good album, and more or less a straight pop album. And I mean that in a good way, because we just think of Yoko howling all the time. And a lot of people think that's all she ever did musically, but it's not true at all. That's a very good album. And also I think the subtitle refers to the seemingly infinite number of ideas that Yoko has, which are in this book. The book is about 520 odd pages, I think. But I did have it's a sort of detailed skim. It sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, but yeah, I skimmed through the rest of it in fairly fine detail to have a good idea of the content of the overall book. And of course, I'm going to finish it. Overall, I give a huge recommendation if you want to know about the art of Yoko Ono and also her upbringing and her core perspectives and philosophies on life, which are very unique. She's definitely a very unique lady. This book is just full of Yoko's many ideas, and it's interesting that we've speculated that John, had he lived, would have been a great Twitter user. We've often talked about how he'd probably fire off angry tweets and then have to delete them or dial back somehow. And it seems that Yoko has used Twitter through the years to fire off missives to the world as well. There's great poetry in both Madeline's writing and some of Yoko's tweets and quotes. Madeline was on the Things We Said Today podcast with Dan Richter on there as well, and it was a great interview. Dan feels about Yoko pretty similar to Madeline. I think that she's a wise woman and almost some kind of angel, really, who's endured great hardships and come out the other side smiling. I mean, I'll give my opinion of that in a second. The book isn't a straight chronology, but as I was reading about her early life and her early career as an artist, I was thinking about where John was in his life at any given point. And they were both children of the Second World War in a sense. John was born during it, although there was that myth that he was born during an air raid, which wasn't true. And Yoko was profoundly affected by the firebombing of Tokyo. They were both highly artistic children. I think they were both lonely children. Madeline mentions loneliness quite a few times in the book. They both experienced loss and trauma, and I think both felt they didn't belong and had ideas that they couldn't communicate to those around them. And Madeline herself has said that they were both damaged people, which I agree with. And I was reminded of the insert photos for the twin Plastic Ono Band albums in 1970, which were John and Yoko as children, thousands of miles away. Both very good-looking kids, adorable, really, and with a bit of magic in their eyes, perhaps, a bit of a glint in their eye. And there was just one particular event that I wanted to comment on. On December the 18th, 1960, Yoko was 27 and was giving her first performance in New York. I think it was her first performance. I hope I got that right. With Lamont Young, and it was in a cold water loft apartment. I think it was in Greenwich Village. And it was Yoko's conceptual pieces with Lamont Young contributing drone music, which is interesting since John would write a song with a one-chord drone, Tomorrow Never Knows, 5 or 6 years later, and George would write, obviously, Within You, Without You, in 67. But on that very day, 20-year-old John Lennon, many miles away, had just been rocking for about 4 months in Hamburg and was back in Liverpool in his aunt's house, licking his wounds from being deported from Hamburg and contemplating his future, and kind of flashed in my mind, maybe he was dreaming of an exotic woman from the East who would help him make sense of his life. That's a nice romantic image. So in late 1960, Yoko's a struggling artist and John's a struggling musician, and both expressing themselves in very different ways. But then, of course, John had, even back then, a parallel mode of artistic expression, which was in poetry, stories and drawings. I can imagine when they got together properly in 1968, they would have done what many couples do, which is to show each other their stuff in terms of, their creative output and share their histories. And it must have been wonderful for them to have found common ground between the two cultures they grew up in. So, I buy it wholeheartedly. I've said this before, up to then, in terms of the John and Yoko narrative. And Madeline's book seems to be mostly about the art, but there are bits of biography and, like I said, some chronology of events. And here's the problem, you see, when Madeline was on one of the shows she did, the book was described as the definitive biography of Yoko Ono. And it reminded me a little bit of when Ken Womack did his John Lennon 1980 book a few years ago. And I think someone described that as, this is the definitive account of John Lennon in 1980. And by definition, it wasn't, because Ken was on Glass Onion and he agreed with me, my observation that the book had a narrative which was about John Lennon's creative rebirth. It wasn't about his state of mind. Ken agreed with that. So if you think this is a definitive biography of Yoko Ono, the problem is that there's nothing negative in this book. Or, there's bits here and there. If I find I'm wrong after reading the whole book, I'll happily correct myself. But there's nothing about, the shabby way they treated Cynthia in 1968. Admittedly, that's mostly John because it was his wife. Or the general treatment of Julian and Cynthia as regards the aftermath of the murder. Of course, I understand that, Yoko had been through an unbelievably traumatic event of just seeing your husband, regardless of what their relationship was, still their husband, just gunned down right in front of you. I mean, I can't even imagine that. And I think a lot of commentators on Yoko have been very hard on her and not acknowledged that. So I acknowledge that. As I've said before, I buy the John Yoko story up to about 1973, and Madeline makes a correct assertion that they were stifling each other, and maybe Yoko decided that being with May Pang was better for John than being with groupies, because he was going to need sex, obviously. She wanted to have a sexual relationship with David Spinoza, which is in the book. And that's fine, it's up to them. Maybe they had some sort of mutual agreement. That's their right, because they're the two people in the relationship. But from this point on, what you find in the book is totally the Coleman end of the continuum all the way. It's 100% official story that's pushed by the Lennon estate, and Elliot Mintz, who's paid by Yoko. I don't know what his official job title is nowadays, but he's a friend of Yoko's, but he's also been paid over the years to keep this going, this version of the story. I would say to some extent a myth, but again, as we've covered so many times on this podcast, that's up to you. We get the story of Paul helping to get John and Yoko together, which I think he revealed in 1986. It's basically the lyrics of She Loves You, isn't it? I've spoken to her. She wants you back, but you've got to work at it. And I'm sure there's some truth to that. But in the book, we get the Elton concert, November 74, and John and Yoko lock eyes and realise it's destiny to get back together. May Pang gets her usual 3 lines in this book as she got in Coleman and the Imagine 88 documentary. As I said on a few episodes back, I wasn't mad on the Being John Lennon book by Ray Connolly, but I think he got closest to the truth. And he admitted John went home with May Pang that night. Okay, maybe he had Yoko on his mind, maybe not. They had a flat in New York for a short time while Yoko was living there. According to May, John told her he was going to divorce Yoko. And again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be hard on you, Madeline, but there was a bit where we know John nearly went to New Orleans to work with Paul. And in the book it says John was going to go to New Orleans, but he couldn't make it. There's nothing about the smoking hypnosis cure that left John in terrible shape, and how he came back to May looking like a zombie, like he'd literally been hypnotized, just like he did in 1968 when Cynthia found them in Kenwood.
Now, if we skip right to the very end of the relationship with John, let's summarize it. You were together for 18 months between 73 and 75. Both in love, looking to buy a house, and John was looking again to work with Paul. Then Yoko invites John over to her house in Dakota for a hypnosis session to stop John from smoking. And this is really when the relationship changed overnight. Now, tell me about this, please.
Well, the only thing I can tell you right now is the fact that I had a bad feeling because she was so insistent on having him come that day. You got your gut feeling, and you just roll with it. And I did, and I told him, and he said, "There's nothing to worry about. Don't worry. And he said, listen, I'll be home this evening. Let's go out for a nice dinner, wherever you want to go. And then let's make plans and get ready to go see Paul and Linda down in New Orleans. And as he's walking out the door, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, my God, I just did not like the feeling. She wouldn't let me speak to him. It was a whole control thing over the weekend. And by the time I did get to see him, I looked at him, and he looked strange. And I said, what actually happened? He goes, I don't know. He goes, I drank some tea. I was throwing up, and then all of a sudden something, and he couldn't even explain it, and all he could say was, Yoko's allowed me to come home. And I thought, interesting. Interesting choice of words.
That's weird, isn't it?
Yes, and so I just leave it from there. I think everybody else can, you can make up your mind on
basically,
how it goes from there.
Hypnotized, and it changed his feelings overnight, and the relationship was over.
I just don't think it was, in hindsight, it was just only hypnotism, but I think that was part of it.
That was part of something yeah, okay.
Yeah, but he couldn't stop calling me.
Yes, because wasn't you still physically intimate with John, even though he was back in a sense with Yoko?
Well, she said that it was good for immigration that they looked like they were together. And he was having the toughest time with that because, in essence, we really emotionally didn't break up. We were still together, and we was about to buy the house. It was the whole thing. And he called me the year that he died. I mean, he called me from South Africa.
There's none of that. This narrative is so simple and romantic, and not just saying the narrative in this book, I'm saying this official version. It's simple, romantic. It pleases people who want the nice version. And I'm afraid, there are a fair amount of Beatle commentators out there. I'm not going to name names. I'm not here to make enemies, all right? I've taken a lot of inspiration from other podcasts and authors and such, and hopefully they've taken a bit from me as well. But there are people that don't want to look at the dark sides of anything. They just want everything to be nice, and everyone to be happy. And there's a place for that, all right? I wouldn't recommend the opposite. There was a period of about 6 months in about 2011, 2012, when I decided, on my truth journey that I wanted to find out the truth about as many things as possible. So I investigated things like, the food industry and the weapons industry and really the war industry, because it is the military industrial complex. I delved into it as deep as you could possibly delve while staying relatively sane. And after a few months, I felt like I didn't want to go on, which is not to say I was actually going to do it, but you get that desolate feeling where, life is hopeless. I've said before, caution people, if you're a person that likes truth, don't delve too deeply because it's ugly, believe me. So there's a place for the positive spin on life. And to her credit, Madeleine has never promoted this book. I don't think it's on the blurb as a definitive biography. It was someone else who said that, but there's nothing about Yoko blocking calls from John's relatives and friends in England and they can't all be lying, Like I said, this book is mostly about art and it's very well written. It's a beautifully written love letter to Yoko, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. But as with the Womack book on John, don't think of it as a definitive biography. It's one side. It's a positive spin on her life, let's call it. I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Actually, I did have a couple more things, but they're not about the book, about Yoko herself. I mean, she has some great philosophies and ideas, but I think her and Paul and Ringo and John, even before he died, they have this habit of lapsing into these spiritual cliches, and you've probably all seen these John Lennon fake quotes that are going around the internet, and they're very popular because they're so simple, you see, and sometimes there's a place for that. John had a way of boiling things down to slogans, but this idea that all we have to do to change the world is just say that we love each other and spread good vibes, and you've got Ringo Starr flipping the peace sign and saying peace and love, every 30 seconds and tweeting about it all the time. I love the hippie philosophy, and I probably am a hippie at heart, but is that going to stop first world banks and corporations crippling the third world with debts they can never pay back and corrupting their leaders? Is that going to stop top capitalists starting wars for other people to fight? I mean, Yoko famously said at one of the bed-ins, she'd go to bed with Hitler, and that's an interesting idea. If you don't take it too literally, evil people or people doing wrong, they need to be shown love in some way. I get all that, but what about civil rights? Were they won in the 50s and 60s by firing off messages of good vibes? I mean, another lady, in fact, who had a 90th birthday a few days after Yoko, posthumously, was Nina Simone. She was involved in that. Obviously, Martin Luther King, the Selma marches, we know some of that. They were won by struggle and often people laying down their lives, and What about the American labor unions in the early 20th century? There's a fantastic set of documentaries called Plutocracy, and he's on about number 5, I think. I've watched them all, but he's maybe making more. They're made by a guy called Scott Noble of Metanoia Films. That's decades of struggle, and lobbying and political actions as well as physical actions taken to the streets. It's not just these good vibes and these token messages. And also, if Yoko's so interested in truth, why did she block the Peter Doggett book, Prisoner of Love? I understand she'd been burned by Goldman in the 1980s because she recommended Marnie Hare to him as a source. And Caitlin, when she was on Marnie Hare's Daughter, she confirmed that. Caitlin was sure that her mother wouldn't just make up stuff for Goldman to put in his book. Maybe it got embellished, how these things go. But Peter Doggett is a reputable author. He's not Goldman. Goldman had form with his Elvis book and the John Lennon Community, although I was only about, I think, 13 when that came out, so I had no idea. But I'm sure people were expecting something like the Elvis book, and that's pretty much what they got. But I think what it is that Yoko, Paul, Ringo, they've all had a lot of struggle in their lives, if you look at their lives. But I personally think that if you're famous and super rich for decades, there's a point where, despite all your good intentions, you can't possibly be in touch with the ordinary man or woman on the street. I mentioned at the top of the show why this podcast has been delayed. It's because we've just done a podcast on Film Gold, a tribute to Michael Caine, who also turned 90. His birthday's March the 14th, and I think that's already happened by the time you're hearing this. He's done, I think, 3 memoirs, and the most recent one was called Blowing the Bloody Doors Off. Can't imagine where they got that from. And it's sort of life lessons of Michael Caine. And, I love it up to a point. And he had a life of relative struggle as well, fairly humble upbringing. But after a while, the things that he would consider problems from the vantage point of, like I say, being rich and famous for decades, over 50 years in his case, and the same with Paul and Ringo, doesn't make them bad people, but you can't possibly be in touch because you get so conditioned by what the values are of that world. I think that's all I'm going to say. Like I say, one more recommendation of the book by Madeleine Boccaro, In Your Mind, The Infinite Universe of Yoko Ono. And with all that said, let's get to the main body of today's show. So I'm going to be reading parts of this book, a lot of them, in fact, and interjecting, which is a modus operandi I use on one of my other podcasts, Life and Life Only. Little plug there. I'm still trying to get that one a bit more established. It's in the show notes. And like the Yoko book, in fact, these interviews are just full of ideas and life philosophies. I'm going to focus mostly on John's parts, since this is a John Lennon podcast, and since I've obviously just talked about Yoko quite a bit. I'm looking at all these bits I've picked out, and I feel like I could be here for the rest of my life, to be perfectly honest. This is going to be long, folks, so strap yourselves in. It's surely going to be a 2-parter, and I'll find some kind of halfway point where I can cut it off. But there's a lot here, and again, this is the official version. This is one of the bedrocks of the official version, and a lot of these quotes I recognised when I heard the audio were used in the Imagine 1988 documentary, which we've reviewed on this podcast, and which, again, I'd recommend as a part of the John Lennon starter kit, but you need to delve a bit deeper as well. Anyway, so let's get going. So in the blurb of this book, it says that the book reflects 20 hours of tapes taken by leading Playboy interviewer David Sheff over 3 weeks in September 1980. It's a rare and poignant document and a testament to one of the shapers of the late 20th century. So the way the book is laid out, before any of the transcripts of the interviews, there's the build-up to the interviews themselves. I don't think it was just David Sheff who was asking the questions, because in the book they have Lennon and then a quote from him and then Playboy. So I think it was a couple of people who are asking the questions. And then in between the extracts of the question and answer parts, he talks about, John came in for this interview or they left, because obviously the interviews were done at various times. And I don't know if the book is in order chronologically with the interviews. I'm not sure about that. But it doesn't really matter, because I just want to focus on what I thought were the most interesting quotes. As I say, it's a lot. It generally has a very warm sense about it. And again, as I was saying earlier, I'm not saying that's not necessarily true. I just think it's not the whole truth. But they really lay their cards on the table, because the very first quote from John Lennon is, "I've been baking bread." And then Playboy says, "Bread and looking after the baby." And then Playboy, with what secret projects going on in the basement? And John Lennon says, are you kidding? There were no secret projects going on, because bread and babies, as every housewife knows, is a full-time job. There ain't no space for other projects. And then we get that stuff he talked about. I think he may have said this to Peebles, actually, but you get the idea that he was expecting a gold record when he made bread, but all that happened was that people ate it, and that was a success. So he learned a bit about housewives, and that's great. I love all that stuff. I will take some bits from the Playboy audio, so I'll be quoting John Lennon sometimes, and then I'll play pertinent bits. It's hard to wade through the 3.5 hours, that's the only thing, but I think probably I'll use his quotes when he's talking about his songs, hopefully other bits as well. It's such a tremendous responsibility to see that the baby has the right amount of food and doesn't overeat and gets the right amount of sleep. If I, as house mother, had not put him to sleep and made sure that he was in the bath by 7:30, no one else would have. It's a tremendous responsibility. Now I understand the frustration of those women because of all the work, and there's no gold watch at the end of the day. So gold watch, gold records, you get the idea. Again, you know, what I'd slightly contest there is the idea that he was doing that. He's giving the impression that he was doing that all the time, whereas Caitlin said, and others have said, that, you know, he would tend to be one of those dads who would come with high energy and then disappear for a while. John and Yoko talk about finding what's most important in their life, and John says, it was more important to face ourselves and face that reality than to continue a life of rock and roll showbiz, going up and down with the winds of either your own performance or the public's opinion of you. And it was something else too. Let's use Picasso as an example. He just repeated himself into his grave. It's not to take away from his great talent, but his last 40 years were a repetition. It didn't go anywhere. What do you call that? Living on your laurels. So he was kind of talking about when he retired from the business, and I made this comparison many, many years ago, maybe on this podcast, with Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando gave up the stage because he was giving too much of himself, and he didn't like repeating himself. And I think John was very like that. So rather than just go on churning out albums, as obviously a lot of his contemporaries are still doing now, or were until recent years, he wanted to give it up because he had that short attention span, but also an unwillingness to just keep repeating himself, as he said. He's talking about inspiration, and John says, well, the spirit moved me. Yoko's spirit never left her, but my spirit moved me to write suddenly, which I haven't done for a long, long time. Also, I'd been concentrating on being a house husband, and I'd sort of half-consciously wanted to spend the first 5 years of Sean's life actually giving him all the time I possibly could. I mean, he's saying, inspired me to write, which I hadn't done for a long, long time. And of course, this point's been made many times also. We've got this bootleg between the lines where he was composing all the time. So it's interesting to think about how calculated this is. It's probably one of those things that you often find where someone is, it's almost like they're convincing themselves that it's the truth. So he may have been remembering a day in Bermuda before they started recording the album where, you know, he tidied the songs up. And I think Woman, the song Woman, came out of inspiration. Maybe early tapes of that or not, I can't remember, but this is a myth. I'm sorry. He says, I'm going to be 40 and life begins at 40, so they promise. And I believe it too, because I feel fine. I'm excited. It's like 21, you know, hitting 21. It's like, wow, what's going to happen next? And even in Goldman, you know, he said that John was on a high to some extent. Goldman would probably think it was a high due to something else. But again, the truth is in the middle. You know, it's he had good days and bad days, I'm sure. We also get John talking about Walls and Bridges, and a few people have talked about this, that he disses that album a bit because it was the album he made when he was with May Pang. Quite apart from him seeming to be in very terrible shape, obviously he was at the beginning of 74, but those interviews that he gives promoting Walls and Bridges, he just seems so up and clear-headed. It doesn't sound like a drug high, like a babbling John Lennon. It's a relaxed John Lennon. One of the quotes, just to go back slightly to that Elton concert in 1974, is that Yoko said that John looked very lonely up there on stage. You know, and I could believe that at that moment, you know, because John had that ability to kind of look like a little boy at times and sound like a little boy, you know, as we said before in the song God, where he says, you know, don't believe in, he goes, just believe in me. And the way he sings and the way it's recorded, he sounds like a lost little child. So I can believe that. To be fair, though, he's not really dissing the album here, these quotes. He's just saying he was depressed. So he says, I think I was more in a morass mentally than Yoko was. If you listen to Walls and Bridges, you hear somebody that's depressed. You can say, well, it's because of years of fighting deportation and this problem and that problem, but whatever it was, it sounds depressing. The guy knows how to make tables, but there's no spirit to the tables. I'm not knocking the record, but I'm saying I showed where I was. So the other famous quote is that it was the work of a semi-sick craftsman, but there he's not saying the album's a bad album. I've never understood why people don't like Walls and Bridges, and I feel it's a bit, I hate to sound patronising, he says, just about to say something really patronising. I think a lot of people probably would take John Lennon's opinion on his work and maybe let it influence them. And I say that because I've done that in the past, you know. This is not me from on high. And he's got an interesting quote here. Walking away is much harder than carrying on. I know, I've done both. I hadn't stopped from 62 to 73, on demand, on schedule, continuously, and walking away was hard. What it seemed like to me was, this must be what guys go through at 65 when suddenly they're not supposed to exist anymore and they're sent out the office. I thought, well, oughtn't I? Shouldn't I? Shouldn't I be like going to the office or something, producing something? Because I don't exist if my name isn't in the papers or if I don't have a record out on the charts or whatever. He always credits Yoko with enlightening him. It may be in these interviews, but certainly in 1980 he talked about a teacher-pupil relationship. But it just seems a bit excessive to me. One of the other narratives was that he wanted mother rather than a girlfriend. You know, Maypang said, I wanted to be his lover, his girlfriend, not his mother. That's in The Real John Lennon. It's a documentary that I referenced a couple of episodes back as well. It's not a bad one. It's pretty good. And he says, I was stuck in the feeling that one was not justified in being alive unless one was fulfilling other people's dreams, whether they were contractual dreams or the public's dreams, or fulfilling my own dreams and illusions about what I thought I was supposed to be, which in retrospect turned out to not be what I am. It's interesting, he talks about, you know, a lot of artists kill themselves because of it, like Dylan Thomas, or through insanity like a Van Gogh, or VD and craziness like a Gauguin. And I'm sure a lot of artists do go through this. You feel like, A, you don't exist if you're not creating, and B, you somehow owe it to the public. I wonder if podcasters think like that. You know, some podcasters are doing it as a career, you know, and I say, good for them, lucky them. Some get some income from it, and I get a little bit of income from it. But notice at the beginning I said, oh, you know, sorry I didn't get an episode out in February. I feel a responsibility now. It's a nice thing, really. I take his point as well that you should really be doing it for that reason. You should be doing it because you like it. But I guess anyone who gets an audience, whether it's me doing this podcast or John Lennon with an audience of millions, you do feel, maybe owe them isn't even the right word, but you feel like, I get so many messages of goodwill from all over the world. And I've talked before about, you know, I'll get a truck driver from Australia or somewhere saying that, you know, my 3-hour commute is easier when I'm listening to your podcast. It's very heartwarming. The bits I don't like about the book are him talking about the separation. I mean, we've already covered this, really. Maypang is basically airbrushed out of it. But, of course, Maypang recently put out her own version, this documentary.
John decided we should move in together. We ended up finding the perfect apartment. Can you imagine? I was 23. And my first live-in boyfriend was John Lennon. We took the bedroom and we fixed up the guest room for Julian.
It was an absolute joy and a pleasure. It was just Dad and May, and it was just a happy, happy time. Especially in some of the photographs, you can see that May took of us, of Dad and I together.
I seem to be the guy in New York that all the Englishmen say hi to, you know. Which is good, you know, if Mick's in town, Paul's in town, anybody comes, I love it, you know.
Paul McCartney used to say, you know, come over to our house, and Ringo and George and Elton. Funny bit, we were trying to get in touch with Paul and Linda for dinner. We didn't reach them. We left them a message, and as we're coming up 61st Street in the cab, we look over into the other cab, and it's Paul and Linda. And all of a sudden we yell out, and the two Beatles, right, John and Paul, stick their heads out and they're screaming at one another, saying, I'll talk to you later, and as the car's moving, they split. And it was wild to see that.
You know, I haven't seen that, but if anyone's seen that, please feel free to leave a comment about it. But, you know, I think it's fair enough she's getting her version, but all these things, be it Beatles or anything else, becomes a he said, she said. And it's up to us to figure out the truth. The Playboy interviewer asked, was your decision to become a house husband a result of the separation as well? John says, I could say yes, and then it would be a pat thing. Oh, they did this because of this, but it's not true at all. There's just more to it than that. But you could say, or I could say, because she might say a different thing entirely. Yes, right, we got back together and we decided this was our life, that having a baby was important to us and that everything else was subsidiary to that, and therefore everything else had to be abandoned. That abandonment gave us the fulfillment we were looking for and the space to breathe and think and re-establish our dreams. And he carries on with that. But, even John's saying there, it's not simple. So in a way, he's almost contradicting the fairly simple narrative he's putting out at times. I mean, there's a lot in this book and in the interviews. Another recommendation to one of my Beatle compatriots on something about the Beatles. There was a great show called Double Fantasy Revisited. I can't remember who the guest was, but I'll put it in the show notes. And that was talking about how if you kind of analyse Double Fantasy, which is obviously the album that came out just after these interviews or around the same time, the Playboy edition was on the shelves before he died. They went through with a fine-tooth comb everything about the album Double Fantasy, and I guess they touched on the interviews as well, and they found that darker side, it was hidden in there, it was almost hidden in plain sight, which is another reason I'm not mad on this official version, because even John Yoko weren't quite promoting just that version either. Obviously that was predominant in these interviews. I'm reminded of something I quoted, I think it was in the episode I put out just before Christmas, the Doggett book, The Art and Music of John Lennon. He talks about how John Lennon's last 3 interviews, the 5th of December with Rolling Stone, which almost went full circle really, from the Rolling Stone, the Lennon Remembers interview, and then Peebles on the 6th of December, and then RKO on the 8th. And how there were 3 different John Lennons, the spiky one on the 5th, the utterly charming one on the 6th, and this babbling John Lennon on the day he died. And Coleman put that down to coke, not surprisingly, but I think Doggett talked about him as speedy, which is not accusing him of being on speed, but it's sort of babbling John Lennon. The Playboy interviews, he seems fairly calm on the audio, which is one of the things I liked about it, really. The next section, the interviewer talks about a possible tour in 1981, which is obviously tough to think about in retrospect, but John says, we probably will, I wouldn't have believed it a month ago, but then I thought, what the hell, why not? If it's enjoyable and it doesn't become something that one doesn't want to do, because it's nice to get up and sing sometimes, it's nice to make music. I don't want to get mixed up in deals and business and spin-offs and pressures, though, because I don't need that anymore. Once was enough. Of course, if he had become a touring musician, there would have been all that pressure, it would have happened. So would he have been able to get away with just a 1981 tour and then a retreat for a bit? The more I think about the possibilities post-1980, I really think he would have flitted in and out of the public and in and out of live gigs. I just can't see him doing what Paul and others do in the Dylan doing the never-ending tour of just constant touring. I just can't see it. Of course I could be wrong. They talk about Imagine for a bit, and then John Lennon says, I don't want it to come across like I am or we are the awakened spirit. You are the sheep that will be shown the way. It's not that, and that's the danger in saying anything, People are looking for leaders. Don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. That's obviously a quote from Subterranean Homesick Blues. John's chuckling. We'll get into that, but, leaders is what we don't need. We can have figureheads and we can have people that we admire and like to have standing up and all that. We can have examples, but leaders is what we don't need. It's the utopian bit again. We're all members of the conceptual utopia, so let's not go round and round it. It's one world, one people, and it's a statement as well as a wish. So welcome to the dress rehearsal of Double Fantasy. Yes, I wanted to bring up at some point a book called Illusions by Richard Bach. Probably his most famous book is Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and they're written in the 70s, I believe. And this book called Illusions, the very, very quick synopsis, is a guy who discovers another guy who takes people on plane rides. He makes a living doing that. He discovers that this guy appears to have magical powers, and it turns out that this guy is actually the Messiah. But the reason he's staying anonymous is that when he revealed himself and the media got hold of the story, every man and his dog came to see this guy to solve all their problems. So it's a fascinating thing that John Lennon was totally tapped into, this need to have leaders, this need to have not only your own mum and dad, but to have mummy, daddy, government or religious leader or pop star, of course. That's a very, very interesting area to look at and to think about in your own life. Why do you need leaders? Why do you need famous people who are more attractive and more successful than you, apparently? Of course, when you see a lot of them without makeup, or they don't look so great, or without cosmetic surgery nowadays. Not everyone, of course, but a lot of them. They seem to come back to the split quite a bit. I think I really needed some space because I was used to being an artist and free and all that. This is Yoko. And when I got together with John, because we're always in the public eye, I lost the freedom, and also both of us were together all the time. John says 24 hours a day, and the pressure was particularly strong on me because of being the one who stole John Lennon from the public or something. Whatever the reason is, I was under very strong pressure, and I think my artwork suffered. I suffered a lot, and so I thought I wanted to be free from all that. I needed the space to think. And I mentioned at the top of the show, Approximately Infinite Universe. There's another one called Feeling the Space. It's quite amazing that Yoko came out with all these songs. 40 songs, I guess, if you include all the ones that didn't have space. 30 or 40 songs. And it was a time when John was having a bit of a creative drought. You know, the Mind Games album wasn't too bad, but probably not a classic. We get more about The Lost Weekend and Keith Moon and Harry and all that. You know, I was saying Elliot Mintz peddles the official story, but on one of the documentaries he makes a good point that for the Lost Weekend myth, if it is a myth, of just this constant partying for 18 months, that clearly wasn't the case. For that to be perpetuated, all you really need is 4 or 5 scandalous stories. And Elliot Mintz said, you know, I'm sure we've all, over 18 months, probably had a few good nights down the pub. Being a bit ironic there. They're good nights in the sense of getting loaded, but then a lot of the time John was suffering quite a bit. Madeline in her book talks about him bellowing out Yoko's name, but he also was bellowing out May's name as well. If you go to the conspiratorial angle, some believe Yoko Ono may have been John Lennon's handler, quote unquote. And I know, you know, if you've never looked into that, that sounds completely crazy. But if you wanted to go down that road, you'd have to really read the history of the CIA and learn more about mind control and MK Ultra and all that kind of thing. I occupy some sort of middle ground. I do find it a bit suspicious that both in 1968, as evidenced by Cynthia, and 1975, as evidenced by May Pang, John Lennon seemed under hypnosis or just had this blank expression and this disembodied voice. I mean, who knows? I want to make a comparison of John and Ringo, for example. Ringo obviously had talent. You know, I think he's a decent actor. He's obviously a very good drummer. He's emerged into an okay songwriter, but I think what saved John, perhaps, was that he had the songwriting, you know, he had the work, he had the means to create songs and create albums without having to rely on others, as Ringo did. John ties The Lost Weekend to the Hamburg years by talking about exaggerated stories, and another Beatle compatriot, Richard Buskin, on the Beatles Naked, they did a good podcast called John Lennon's First Lost Weekend, talking about the period after Stu Sutcliffe died. I mean, that anniversary is coming up for 60 years as well. Amazing. John was drinking brandy Alexanders with Harry Nielsen in the mid-70s. And I remember I got into Kahlua and milk, which is it's not quite the same, but the milk, it's the milk aspect of it, just makes it taste like a milkshake. And I remember we went out, I think we were watching the Cup final. This is when I was about 23, something like that. And I think me and someone else, we drank something like 15 Kahluas and milks over the whole day. And we felt drunk, but we didn't have that. Ironically enough, it wasn't that aggressive. It was more of a soft drunkenness. So it's quite interesting that John went off the rails. I think the brandy Alexanders are significant only in that you could drink vast amounts of them because they don't taste as harsh as beer or whiskey or straight brandy, let's say. So I think that may have been the key to that. John says, on brandy Alexanders, I'm a very loud heckler. So he's talking about when he was at the Smothers Brothers. So I yelled, Dickie, you're an arsehole. Tommy tried to cover it up. I don't know. What bothered me was that the Bring Back the Smothers Brothers thing is part of the Bring Back the Beatles and Dig Up John Kennedy things. People want Ted Kennedy to be John Kennedy and the people that used to be the Beatles to be the Beatles. Although I regret hurting anyone's feelings, I still feel that way about the act. I always thought Dickie was a wimp and Tommy was all right. Maybe I shouldn't have said it out loud. Who cares? John always had that mind that made all these weird associations. So he's right about the Beatles. People wanted to bring back the Beatles, but dig up John Kennedy. He has that writer's way of bringing up quite abstract things, and you kind of know what he means, but he doesn't mean it all literally. This is very poignant, what he says. If I died the way Dylan Thomas died, they'd be saying, what a wonderful, colourful way to go. Because I'm alive, it's not so wonderful. It was the worst time of my life. Of course, as he was saying that, he only had 3 months to live. This is Yoko. Early on, when John was a Beatle, we stayed in a room and John and I were in bed and the door was closed and all that, but not locked. And one of the Beatle assistants just walked in and talked to him as if I wasn't there. John says he was used to people being in bed with me, so any female was just sort of nobody. Yoko, it was mind-blowing. I was invisible. John, and when she complained to me about it, I couldn't understand. The same kind of thing happened in the studio. She would say to an engineer, I'd like a little more bass or a little more treble. And they'd look at me and say, what did you say, John? I guess he's talking about the studio when John and Yoko are recording, not the Beatles, because that would be quite funny if she was asking for a bit more bass or treble on her microphone during a Beatles session. I presume it's not that. And then the interesting thing, John says, now I know what she's talking about. In Japan, when I ask for a cup of tea in Japanese, they look at Yoko and ask, he wants a cup of tea in Japanese. So John got a bit of that himself, which I guess that was good for him, really, to see the boot on the other foot. Okay, skipping forward. Now, this is interesting. John Yoko both at various times talk about Aldous Huxley and George Orwell and the visions of the future that came from Huxley's Brave New World in the 30s and then 1984 by George Orwell in the late 40s. The stuff they say about it isn't particularly insightful, in my opinion, but just the fact they bring up test tubes and incubators and that's Aldous Huxley. And what it is in Brave New World, people are put in their place, literally put in their place in society by being sleep-taught. So when they're a baby or a small child, they will be given, I don't know if Walkmans existed then, but something like a tape that says, I am alpha, I am alpha, I am alpha, I am alpha, or I am beta, I am beta. And it's this different strata of society. But by repeating the message, you get the message that that's your place. And I would argue that's exactly what media does, mainstream media, but in a more subtle way. And if you want to research this, a book I'd recommend is Amusing Ourselves to Death. But there's also a graphic. I'll put it in the show notes if I can find it. And it's talking about the two visions of the world. So the Orwell version has come true in the sense of cameras. I mean, I've got a camera on my computer as I'm talking to you, and obviously smartphones as well. The Huxley one was more, rather than ruling by fear, it was ruling by distraction. It was killing people with pleasure rather than pain. So distracting people with TV shows and all kinds of things.
It's a question of education to teach people to be on their guard against the sort of verbal booby traps into which they're always being led, to analyze the kind of things that are said to them. I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values, that every human being is unique. And it is, of course, on this genetical basis that the whole idea of the value of freedom is based.
This is Aldous Huxley. Mr. Huxley wrote Brave New World, a novel that predicted that someday the entire world would live under a frightful dictatorship. Are there specific devices or methods of communication which diminish our freedoms?
Well, there are certainly devices which can be used in this way. Hitler used terror on the one kind, brute force on the one hand, but he also used a very efficient form of propaganda. He had the radio, which he used to the fullest extent, and was able to impose his will on an immense mass of people. I mean, the Germans were a highly educated people. We mustn't be caught by surprise by our own advancing technology. This has happened again and again in history. And suddenly people have found themselves in a situation which they didn't foresee and doing all sorts of things they didn't really want to do. At present, the television, I think, is being used quite harmlessly. But, I mean, imagine, which must be the situation in all communist countries, where the television, where it exists, is always saying the same thing the whole time, is always driving along. It's drumming in of a single idea all the time. It's obviously an immensely powerful instrument. All technology is in itself morally neutral. These are just powers which can either be used well or ill. It's the same thing with atomic energy. We can either use it to blow ourselves up, or we can use it as a substitute for the coal and the oil which are running out. If you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled. And this they will do partly by drugs, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions, making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
Writing about American political campaigns, you say all that is needed is money and a candidate who can be coached to look sincere.
Well, this is this idea that the candidates had to be merchandised as though they wear soap or toothpaste, and that you had to depend entirely on the personality. I mean, the personality is important, but there are certainly people with an extremely amiable personality, particularly on TV, who might not necessarily be very good in positions of political trust. I mean, what does a democracy depend on? A democracy depends on the individual voter making an intelligent and rational choice for what he regards as his enlightened self-interest in any given circumstance. But what these people are doing is to try to bypass the rational side of man and to appeal directly to these unconscious forces below the surface, so that you are, in a way, making nonsense of the whole democratic procedure, which is based on conscious choice on rational grounds. I must say, I still believe in democracy. If we can make the best of the creative activities of the people on top, plus those of the people on the bottom, so much the better.
So it was interesting that they mentioned that, and I know that John did have, it was either 1984 or Brave New World, or possibly both, on his bookshelves when Maureen Cleave did the interview with him in 1966. So, you know, he was aware of that world beyond left-right entertainment politics. But Amusing Ourselves to Death, I think, is available as an audiobook as well, so that would be well worth your time. So the Playboy guy says, then your purpose is to do more than entertain. The hope is that the record will be inspiring and will move people to feel or act differently, which is just what people want from you, some prescription for life. Is this more responsibility than you would choose to have? So this is expanding on an earlier point. This is John emphatically, no, because it's the same bit about saying that the Beatles led the 60s. It's not true. The idea of leadership is a false god. If you want to use the Beatles or John and Yoko or whoever, people are expecting them to do something for them. That's not what's going to happen. But they are the ones who didn't understand any message that came before anyway. They are the ones that will follow Hitler or follow Reverend Moon or whoever. Following is not what it's about, but leaving messages of this is what's happening to us. Hey, what's happening to you? Is Reverend Moon a reference to Keith Moon of The Who, maybe? Or was there a Reverend Moon? John says, we're sending postcards and letters. That's what we do. And I love that. It's a great metaphor. It's almost like handing out thousands of postcards to the people saying, this is what we're doing. We're not saying you need to do this, but, you know, how's your life going? As he said in one of his interviews. Did you get through it? So that's interesting. The Playboy guy was, of course, referring to double fantasy, because essentially these interviews were to promote double fantasy. Other people would say to promote the John Yoko myth, but I guess the two were going hand in hand, really, at that time. John says, it's the same idea we had for Give Peace a Chance. It wasn't like you have to have peace. Just give it a chance. We ain't giving any gospel here. Just about, how about this version for a change? We think we have the right to have a say in the future, and we think the future is made in your mind, which is very Yoko. And that was a big part of Madeline's book, or her quotes from Yoko in the book. Yoko says, I think it's not so much we, if you meant the two of us, but all of us are part of the future. The future is already within us. I think the world is going around and is alive because some people really know that whatever they think really happens. Isn't on an esoteric intellectual level, but I really believe that whatever you think will happen. And I mean, this is reminding me almost of The Secret, which is a book that really irritated me in a documentary. This idea that in The Secret, I'm saying that the law of attraction, you can get anything you want if you just think about it enough. But of course, in The Secret book and documentary, their definition of success was having a massive house and a trophy wife. So again, with Yoko's ideas, take them on board, but don't take them as a practical plan, because that's not really what they are, to be perfectly honest. There's political action, there's activism, and there's this, which can be a complement to that, if you like. All right, going forward a bit. So this is about John Yoko coming back. So the Playboy guy says, after finding such contentment and happiness in your new roles away from the public, why are you returning to public life? John says, you breathe in and you breathe out. We breathed in after breathing out for a long time. The I Ching calls it sitting still. A lot more can happen when you're not doing anything than when you appear to be doing something. Although it looks that what John and Yoko were doing for 5 years was not doing anything, we were doing a hell of a lot. Sitting still is one way of describing it. Sitting still, amazing things happen, you see. And now we're not sitting still. Now we're moving around. Maybe in a few years we'll sit still again, because life is long, I presume. Again, the unbearable poignancy of that kind of thing. But he's agreeing there with what I said earlier about, the fact that he probably would have had spurts of public life and energy and productivity. Yeah, again, it's interesting that he's quoting the I Ching, but he denounced it in the song God. I think we've talked enough about the John Lennon contradictions over the last few years. But yeah, he says you breathe in, you breathe out. Again, that's quite a Yoko thing as well, isn't it? Something as simple as that. And you breathe in and you have one type of life, and you breathe out and you have another type of life. John also talks about leaving the Beatles to go with Yoko. So in the late 60s, he's comparing leaving the Beatles to coming back into public life. Well, that was a similar experience. I was too scared to break away from the Beatles, but I've been looking for it since 1965 when we stopped touring. And maybe Paul had been too, I don't know. I can't speak for the others. I made a movie, How I Won the War with Dick Lester, which never got seen much, but did me a lot of good. It did me a lot of good to get away, and it was a withdrawal. I was in Almeria, Spain. I wrote Strawberry Fields there, by the way. I was there for 6 weeks, and it gave me time to think and to be separate from the others, but still be working and not be left in the house alone. And I used to be there and think, like a lot of people do, well, what can I do if I don't do that? During these interviews, there are a few themes that he keeps coming back to, and he's still thinking about as an artist, which is his job, basically. What do I do if I'm not making art? So he says, from 65, I was sort of vaguely looking for somewhere to go, but I didn't have the nerve to really step in the boat by myself and push the boat off. So I sort of hung around, and when I met and then fell in love, it was, my God, this is different from anything else. This is something other. I don't know what it is, but this is fine. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's more than a hit record. It's more than gold. It's more than everything. It's more than. This is something indescribable. And I think he did have a bliss feeling when he went with Yoko in 68. Absolutely. He says, I did free myself physically from the Beatles, but not mentally. Mentally, I was still carrying them around in the back of my head. Although the initial love blinds all. Everything is under shining lights, and you want everybody to be happy just like you. It's rather dizzying. Later on, love is different, and one can slow down a little. It's not less, just different. And so therefore I could lift out of all this garbage that was still being carried round, which was influencing the way I thought and the way I lived and all the rest of it. I'd love to read all this stuff, but we're only a fraction of the way through, about a quarter of the way through all the bits I wanted to do. Yeah, interestingly, I think it's in the documentary Beatlemania, which we talked about quite a bit when I had Chris Purcell and Simon Weitzman on for the Beatles Docs episode 70-something. Norman Smith, otherwise known as Hurricane Smith, I think he was the engineer before Jeff Emmerich, and he went on to produce Pink Floyd. He said that when they came back from their tours in 65 to record Rubber Soul, so October 65, he said he felt something had changed then. The family feeling had gone then. So that's late 65. So that would more or less chime with what John's saying there. Anybody who claims to have some interest in me as an individual artist or even as part of the Beatles has absolutely misunderstood everything I've said if they can't see why I'm with Yoko. If they can't see that, they don't see anything. They're just jacking off to, could be anybody, Mick Jagger or somebody else. Let them go and jack off to Mick Jagger, okay? I don't need it. I absolutely don't need it. Let them chase wings. Just forget about me. If that's what you want, go after Paul or Mick. I ain't here for that. If that's not apparent in my past, I'm saying it in black and green, next to all the tits and asses on page 196. Brilliant reference to Playboy. It's almost just taken for granted, isn't it? Oh, he did an interview in Playboy. How do you think about how many people are buying it for the interview and how many for the pictures? Go play with the other boys. Don't bother me. Go play with the Rolling Wings. But again, he's being disingenuous because he's making out that he's not interested in Paul and Mick. And in that audio diary, I know it's only a 10-minute snapshot, September 1979. He's talking about that, but Fred Seaman and others have said that he was constantly talking about Paul McCartney or comparing himself to Paul McCartney, as much as constantly means. Who knows, folks? I hope I'm just giving you a few things to think about. It's all just interesting stuff, I think. The Playboy interviewer talks at some point of John being sarcastic to a fan. You know, when are you going back to high school? And I'm reminded of when Ghosty, David Wills, was on. We did the John and Elvis show quite a long time ago. He was saying the Beatles had a kind of a teenage attitude to Elvis. They just wanted him to go back and be Elvis. So I think, again, there's a bit of hypocrisy there. But, nobody's perfect. And he says here, again, he's being a bit catty about Mick and the Stones. They're congratulating the Stones on being together 112 years. Whoopee. At least Charlie and Bill still got their families. In the 80s, they'll be asking, why are those guys still together? Can't they hack it on their own? Why do they have to be surrounded by a gang? Is the little leader scared somebody's going to knife him in the back? That's going to be the question. So, yeah, interesting. I don't think people should be congratulated just for staying together. Although, of course, the Stones did have fallings out and periods where they weren't together, and Mick and Keith did solo albums. But it reminds me of something John Cleese said. An interviewer asked him about his failed marriages, and he said, well, if people are together for 10 years, if 9.5 years of that are good, and they have a messy 6-month breakup, is that a failure? Is it automatically something to be cherished and, congratulated for if you just stay together? My grandparents were together for 62 years and they spent a good proportion of that arguing. In fact, when they had their 60th anniversary celebrations, my granddad said half jokingly, but we took it a bit more literally. He said, I was in the Second World War for a few years. Those were the best years of our marriage. We all had a laugh at that. So, I take that point. Okay, it's a bit catty, but I think the Stones should be congratulated for the amazing music they made, certainly up to a point. But do people really want to hear much past, 1973, let's say? Maybe the Some Girls album of 78. But I think John had a difficult relationship with, as he said in that audio diary, the mighty Dylan, the mighty McCartney, the mighty Jagger. I think, it's like the angel and the devil, or it's about the higher self and the shallow side. We've all got that, haven't we? We've got a higher self which makes adult decisions and doesn't have a large ego. But then we've got the other side of us, which is the child, the ego. And I think John had that. He wanted to get away from fame, but he wanted adulation because it was a drug that he'd been taking for quite a number of years. All right, let's go forward a bit. So the interviewer says, do you listen to the radio? John says, music or classical? I don't purchase records. I do enjoy listening to things like Japanese folk music or Indian music. My tastes are very broad. When I was a housewife, I just had music on, background music, because it relaxes you. Music to my ears, as he might have said. Again, it's like, if he says I don't buy records, that's true, but he used to get Fred Seaman to buy them for him. So, I understand there probably were periods, I've had periods as well, when I got tired of pop and rock music, I listened to jazz for 6 months, or classical, because it gets you out of that thing that you already know, and it might teach you a few more musical styles and rules, if you like, or maybe the fact there aren't any rules. Right, another question. Your songs are sung more than most other songwriters, John. How does that feel? John says, I'm always proud and pleased when people do my songs. It gives me pleasure that they even attempt to do them, because a lot of my songs aren't that doable. I go to restaurants and the groups always play Yesterday. Yoko and I even signed a guy's violin in Spain after he played us Yesterday. He couldn't understand that I didn't write the song, but I guess he couldn't have gone from table to table playing I Am the Walrus. A couple of things to say about that. When I was trashing that Yesterday film a couple of years ago, I mentioned that the idea for that came from a BBC show called Goodnight Sweetheart. I'll play the clip if I can find it. This guy lives in the 90s and he finds a portal back to the 40s and pretends he's doing undercover work for the government during the war. The character's played by Nicholas Lyndhurst, who for British viewers was Rodney in Only Fools and Horses. And he passes himself off as a songwriter. He's singing, I am the Eggman, and these people in a 1940s London pub are going, woo, they are the Eggmen, woo, because he's taught them the backing vocals. Quite funny. Also reminded, of course, of Mike Douglas when the John Yoko took over the Mike Douglas show, singing Michelle and saying, he wrote that. And John says, actually, I only wrote the middle 8. Mike Douglas cringingly says, that's the most difficult part, isn't it? Oh, dear. When Madeline and Dan Richter were on the Things We Said Today show, Alan Kozin was very funny about Mike Douglas. He didn't like him because they were talking about the fact that there's going to be a documentary about that. I think all 5 of the shows are on YouTube now, and well worth watching. Just highly surreal television. Okay, we get lots of stuff about Sean and the family. And then we get a very interesting quote. I'm not going to lie to Julian. 90% of the people on this planet, especially in the West, were born out of a bottle of whiskey on a Saturday night, and there was no intent to have children. So 90% of us, that includes everybody, were accidents. I don't know anybody who was a planned child. All of us were Saturday night specials. Julian is in the majority along with me and everyone else. Sean is a planned child, and therein lies the difference. I mean, probably do half an hour on just those quotes. I mean, it's just incredible stuff, really. 90% of the people, especially in the West. Now, why especially in the West? Is that because we drink more? Born out of a whiskey bottle. And I mean, you think about Julian reading that. That's a bit harsh, isn't it? In a way, he's creating even more of a gulf between Julian and Sean, because in this real John Lennon documentary, Fred Seaman says, Julian was hurt.
With Sean, John was very demonstrative, and he was very close and very affectionate. And I think Julian was a little hurt by that, because Julian could see that John and Sean were close, and he wanted to have that same kind of closeness with John, and he couldn't have it.
And I think that's pretty much true. I just would contend that John spent all day with Sean. I mean, what the hell do I know, of course. He said, I don't know anybody who was a planned child. I mean, I can't agree with that. Maybe more people are accidents, more children are accidents than people let on. But, I mean, that just seems so sweeping. Anyway. Yeah, interestingly, of course, Kyoko, Yoko's child, let me say, I'm very, very happy that they reconciled. They nearly reconciled while John was alive. I think it was Thanksgiving or Christmas 79. They'd got a phone call that she was coming, and she didn't show in the end, but Yoko was reconciled with her. Kyoko and Julian were both born in 1963. I like this quote of Yoko. I lost Kyoko when she was about 5. I was sort of an offbeat mother, but we had very good communication. I wasn't particularly taking care of her, but she was always with me on stage or at gallery shows. When she was not even a year old, I took her on stage as an instrument, an uncontrollable instrument, My communication with her was on the level of sharing conversation and doing things. She was closer to my ex-husband because of that. Now, this is interesting. The interviewer says, what happened when she was 5? John and I got together and I separated from my ex-husband, Tony Cox. He took Kyoko away. We tried to get her back. Okay, and then we get this stuff where Goldman's version is that John Yoko kidnapped Kyoko back. Dan Richter and Madeline said that they were trying to get the daughter back legitimately and that Tony had kidnapped her. He said, she said, once again. But then we get this revelation. I mean, this book's been out a while, but I didn't know this, that Kyoko was then told to choose between her parents, which is quite incredible, because the official story says that John was forced to choose at age 5. Now, Mark Lewison has debunked that to some extent. I don't know if he completely debunked that. I can't remember because I haven't read Tune In for a few years. But very interesting parallels there. And we know about all the parallels between Yoko and Linda, going to Sarah Lawrence, although not at the same time, and living in Scarsdale, etc. And then John's back to talking about a rock star. I was the real pig, and it is a relief not to be a pig. The pressures of being a pig were enormous. They were killing me. All those years of trying to be tough and the heavy rocker and heavy womanizer. I don't have any hankerings to be looked upon as a sex object, a male macho rock and roll singer. I got over that a long time ago. I'm not even interested in projecting that. So I like it to be known that yes, I look after the baby and I made bread and I was a house husband and I was proud of it. It was an enlightening experience for me because it was a complete reversal of my upbringing. It's the wave of the future and I'm glad to be in on the forefront of that too. So, they were quite progressive, I guess. And, I totally understand all that stuff. I've never been a rock star, but I suppose I did live the musician's life for a while, and it does get exhausting. And John was like an early new man. I mean, that was a thing in England I think it was really the 90s, but I think in America it was a bit earlier. maybe late 60s or 70s, this idea that men were going to show their feminine sides a bit more. Right, now we're going back to the idea of the Beatles getting back together. So the interviewer says, why is it so unthinkable that the Fab Four get back together to make some music? John says, talking about the Beatles getting back together is an illusion. That was 10 years ago. The Beatles only exist on film and on record and in people's minds. You cannot get back together what no longer exists. We are not those four people anymore. Anyway, why should I go back 10 years to provide an illusion which I know doesn't exist? And the interviewer presses him a bit, says, forget the illusion, what about just to make some music? Why should the Beatles give more? Didn't they give everything on God's earth for 10 years? Didn't they give themselves? Didn't they give all? On one hand, you're like the typical love-hate fan that says, thank you for everything you did for us in the 60s. Will you give me another go, another chance? Just one more miracle. I didn't get enough the first time. The interviewer says, I'm playing devil's advocate. Let's clear it up once and for all. We're not talking about miracles, just good music. John says, why with the Beatles? When Rogers worked with Hart and then he worked with Hammerstein, do you think he should have stayed only with Hart or with Hammerstein? Hammerstein? Epstein? God, we're back here again.
May we have his name, please?
Their manager's name is Mr. Brian Epstein.
Brian Epstein?
Should Dean Martin have stayed with Jerry Lewis because I like them? And then the interviewer says, back to the music. Don't you agree that the Beatles created the best rock and roll that's been produced? John says, I don't. I mean, then you get into the definition of what's rock and roll. The Beatles, you see, I'm too involved in them artistically. I can't listen to them objectively. I listen to them as that track or the day we did the song. So far as I'm concerned, I'm dissatisfied with every record we ever fucking made. There ain't one of them I wouldn't remake. Then we get a quote.
When I was a Beatle, I thought we were the best fucking group in the goddamn world. And believing that is what made us what we were. Just a matter of time before everybody else caught on.
Whether you call it the best pop group or the best rock and roll group or whatever. As far as I was concerned, we were the best. But we thought we were the best before anyone else had ever heard of us back in Hamburg and Liverpool. Then a bit later he says, I heard Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds last night. It's abysmal. The track is just terrible. I mean, it's a great track, a great song, but it isn't a great track because it wasn't made right. You know what I mean? I feel I could remake every fucking one of them better. But that's the artistic trip, isn't it? That's why you keep going, always trying to make that next one the best. Great stuff. I think the fact that he's swearing there is a bit of swearing peppered in these transcripts and interviews, but not that much. So he's obviously a bit passionate about that. Now, I agree with him about one thing. I mean, I made a few albums and I have no need to go back and listen to them. Same with podcasts. I mean, what I do every now and again, every few months, I'll listen back to a very old episode of Glass Onion, just usually about 20 minutes, because I'm just curious. And I mean, when I was doing edits of the transcriptions for my book, I did actually listen back to a lot of the episodes, but I felt like it was more a necessity to listen than while I was editing. But they were quite good, yeah. Quite happy. Again, is he exaggerating? I'd remake every single Beatles record. He probably is, but, you know, I can see his point. Probably in retrospect, he's thinking, well, we were stuck in Abbey Road, and Abbey Road had great engineers and sound effects tapes and random instruments lying around, which was good. But, you know, they were also having to put 2 4-track machines together, and it sounds romantic, you know, Sgt. Pepper being made in a 4-track, but I think they probably would have liked to have recorded in America like the Stones did, but apparently there were tax issues and it all got just very complicated. The interviewer presses him about whether his solo stuff is as good as the Beatles, and he mentions Imagine and Love and the songs from Plastic Ono Band. And concluding this section of the book, it can never be again. Everybody always talks about a good thing coming to an end as if life was over, but I'll be 40 when this comes out. Paul is 38, Elton John, Bob Dylan, we're all relatively young people. The game isn't over yet. Everyone talks in terms of the last record or the last Beatles concert, but God willing, there are another 40 years of productivity to go. Time will tell where the real magic lies. I'm not selecting these just for the poignancy, but I mean, it's just constant references to the future. We are now 42 years since he's been gone, though. Let's think about this. John's just been talking about he shouldn't look to these figureheads, so perhaps we should take a leaf out of his book. But it's still very strange to read all that stuff. Now, the interviewer asks him about Sid Bernstein and all these millions of dollars offered for concerts, and then he talks about charity concerts. And John seems a bit testy here. I mean, he did do quite a few charity events. The 1972 concert, he appeared at the telethon. They did a couple of other things, I think, for good causes. So he had done that. Then we get the slightly more comedic, and this is a good reference back to episode 86 of the podcast. Aside from the millions you've been offered for a reunion concert, how did you feel about producer Lorne Michaels' generous offer of $3,200 for appearing together on Saturday Night Live a few years ago? John says, "Oh yeah, Paul and I were together watching that show. He was visiting us at our place in the Dakota. We were watching it and almost went down to the studio just as a gag. We nearly got into a cab, but we were actually too tired." Then we get quite a famous quote again when the interviewer says, "How did you and Paul happen to be watching TV?" John says, "That was a period when Paul just kept turning up at our door with a guitar. I would let him in, but finally I said to him, 'Please call before you come over. It's not 1956 and turning up at the door isn't the same anymore. Just give me a ring.'" Now, this gets into an area where this is John in 1980. 42 years have passed, as I just said, and we can't just hold him to these quotes. He could have gone back on that in 1981 for all we know. So this idea that Paul was desperate to get back with John and John was hesitant, there's little kernels of truth, but that's one of those myths. And I could see why, in the last episode we talked about Paul talking to Hunter Davis in May 81. You could see why he's exasperated by the canonization of John after he died. But I have been told, or I've been listening to other podcasts, and they said maybe that Saturday Night Live thing didn't happen, or may have happened differently, or something like that. But I still enjoy that scene in Two of Us. That's why I was mentioning Glass Onion 86. Now he talks about people influencing each other with music. This is an interesting part. John says, "All music is rehash. There are only a few notes, just variations on a theme. Try to tell the kids in the 70s who were screaming to the Bee Gees that their music is just the Beatles redone. There's nothing wrong with the Bee Gees. They do a damn good job. There was nothing else going on then." The interviewer says, "Wasn't a lot of the Beatles at least more intelligent?" John, "The Beatles were more intellectual, so they appealed on that level too, but the basic appeal of the Beatles was not their intelligence, it was their music. It was only after some guy in the London Times said there were Aeolian cadences in It Won't Be Long that the middle class started listening to it." Again, another famous quote. "To this day, I don't have any idea what they are. They sound like exotic birds." That's the Aeolian cadences. And I mean, pandiatonic clusters. You just can't make that up, can you? One of them was Not a Second Time, and maybe it was It Won't Be Long, I can't remember. But it was William Mann calling John and Paul the outstanding composers of 1963. But yeah, that thing, All Music is Rehash, documentary I often recommend is called Everything is a Remix, and there's a TED Talk. It's got a couple of different names, or maybe he's done a couple of TED Talks. There's one called Embrace the Remix. Kirby Ferguson is the guy, and he's talking about how Dylan took folk melodies and put his own words to them. The documentary is supposed to inspire, to say that artistic ideas don't come out of nothing, so you can do it as well. So talk about the way the lyrics are misinterpreted, Beatles lyrics. And this is interesting. The interviewer says, "What about when it goes as far as Charles Manson claiming that your lyrics were messages to him?" John Lennon says, "It has nothing to do with me. It's like that guy, Son of Sam, who was having these talks with a dog. Manson was just an extreme version of the people who came up with the Paul is dead thing, or who figured out the initials to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds were LSD. I'm not interested in creating illusion. Plastic Ono was simple and straight. This is what I'm trying to do. I'm always trying to do that. I just want to say direct whatever I'm trying to say. I'm not interested in poetry with a capital P. To me, the best poetry is haiku. Is that how you say it? H-A-I-K-U. All the best paintings are Zen. The less said, the better. I would like to be able to say it without lyrics, but I can't. I'm just verbal. Somehow it is clarity that I'm looking for, clarity of expression. Painting wallpaper or making music is not what I want to do, although I have nothing against it. I'm just trying to put a clear moment on canvas." I mean, what a brilliant quote that is. I mean, he certainly knew what he was talking about with creativity. He had so many interesting ideas, like Yoko, and I can't imagine what their ideas generator was like when they were together, particularly in the early days. But yeah, of course, he did write songs without lyrics, or without many, like I Want You, She's So Heavy. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number was obviously a bit of a comedy number. Well, it's one I really love. But I Want You, She's So Heavy, I want you, and the way he screams it.
I want you. You know I want you so bad, babe. I want you. You know I want you so bad. It's driving me mad. It's driving me mad. Yeah!
What was the quote he said? I don't know if it's in this book or not, where he says, if you were drowning in the river, you wouldn't say, could someone please dive in and help me? You'd shout, help! As he once did, of course.
Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! You know I need someone. Help! Won't you please, please help me? Help me! Help me! Ooh.
Ah, this is a bit that's close to my heart. I heard some Beatles stuff on the radio the other day, and I heard Green Onion. No, Glass Onion. I don't even know my own songs. And this bit's really interesting. He says, I wonder if 40 years from now someone will make a radio show about my life and call it Glass Onion. Did you believe that, folks? He didn't say that, unfortunately. He said, I listened to it because it was a rare track. It's a song they usually don't play. When a radio station has a Beatles weekend, they usually play the same 10 songs. A Hard Day's Night, Help, Yesterday, Something, Let It Be. You know, there's all that wealth of material, but we hear only 10 songs. And, I've made that point ages ago on this podcast that playlists on mainstream radio, they're so limited. The example I always give is, next up, we've got a song by Johnny Cash, and you can absolutely guarantee it's Ring of Fire, Walk the Line, or Folsom Prison Blues, or if you're very lucky, Big River, or one of those. The interviewer carries on, how about the psychoanalyses of why you do what you do? John Lennon, it's only games for people to play. Some people like ping pong, other people like digging over graves. They are all escapes from now. People will do anything rather than be here now. It's irrelevant. If some people want to do it, let them do it. They put all their fantasies on other people, whether it's the Beatles or Elvis or Glenn Miller. I agree with that. People are trying to escape from now. Do some mindfulness, folks, meditation. Forget all the cliches. This is the only moment we have. Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, has been successfully stereotyped, and he's been stereotyped, but fuck all that. The West is afraid of meditation, that's a fact. And it was for thousands of years, but now it's coming in again. But don't do it because it's trendy, do it because it's a fantastic tool for being calm and quietening down the mind. And then not only do you filter out all the crap, you will get visions, not psychedelic visions or mystical visions, but you'll get things will pop into your head that are the important things in life. As I said when I was on Luke's podcast talking about meditation, my dad started meditating 5 or 6 years ago at the age of, 70. I got him into meditation finally after working on him for a while. Within, a week, 2 weeks, he'd forgiven his father, which was a massive thing for him. I won't talk about it now, but I've talked about it on Life and Life Only, and my dad gave me permission to talk about it then, his rough childhood. Anyway, he carries on talking about the Beatles and their role in the 60s and in people's lives, and he says, whatever wind was blowing at the time, moved the Beatles too. I'm not saying we weren't flags on the top of the ship, but the whole boat was moving. Maybe the Beatles were in the crow's nest shouting, land ho, or something like that. But we were all in the same damn boat. You can't go through life looking at the crow's nest. Somebody has to pull the sails up and down. And the interviewer says, say the Beatles were merely the crow's nest, then it makes sense that people look up towards it again. Yoko says, but the Beatles themselves were a social phenomenon, not that aware of what they were doing, in a way. Lennon, under his breath, this Beatles talk bores me to death. Yoko says, I'm sure there are people whose lives are affected because they heard Indian music or Mozart or Bach. More than anything, it was the time and the place when the Beatles came up. Something did happen there. It was as if several people gathered around a table and a ghost appeared. It was that kind of communication. And John says, we tuned into the message, that's all. I don't mean to belittle the Beatles when I say they weren't this or they weren't that. I'm just trying not to overblow their importance as separate from society. And I don't think they were more important than Glenn Miller or Woody Herman or Bessie Smith. It was our generation, that's all. It was 60s music.
Don't you think the Beatles gave every sodden thing they'd got to be the Beatles? That took a whole section of our youth, that whole period, when everybody else was just goofing off. We were working 24 hours a day.
Right, let me get into a bit of politics here, and this is about money. The interviewer says, on the subject of your own wealth, the New York Post recently said you admitted to being worth $150 million. John says, we never admitted anything. I don't know if that's joking or serious. The Post said you had. What the Post says, okay, so we're rich, so what? The interviewer says, the question is, how does that jibe with your political philosophies? John Lennon, in England there are only two things to be, basically. You're either for the Labour movement or for the capitalist movement. You either become a right-wing Archie Bunker if you're in the class I'm in, or you become an instinctive socialist, which I was. That meant I think people should get their false teeth and their health looked after, all the rest of it. But apart from that, I worked for money and I wanted to be rich. So what the hell? If that's a paradox, then I'm not a socialist. But I'm not anything. I was instinctively for the workers because that was the people I was living with, although lots of workers are right-wing. What I used to be was guilty about money. That's why I lost it, either by giving it away or allowing myself to be screwed by so-called managers or whatever you call them. Subconsciously, it was because I was guilty about having money. Then he explains that again. Oh, so much to get into there. I guess John would have been a fan of universal basic income. But yeah, he's saying I'm a hypocrite, but we're all hypocrites. If you really opened up your life, you would find you had loads of conflicting views. So, we always lump it on John Lennon as being a hypocrite. So he's saying, he's a socialist at heart, and there are various strands of socialism, but that idea that everybody should have the basic needs, I mean, who can argue with that? When you look at some of the obscene wealth there is in the world, I still defy anyone to hail, I don't know, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos when there's people starving or people working in Bezos' sweatshops. I don't know if you've ever heard that. It was a lady at the World Economic Forum who was talking about in the United States, in some of those factories, I don't know if it was Amazon or not, but the workers wear diapers when they want to take a dump. They're not allowed to take a break and go to the toilet. Can you believe that? I'm pretty sure, I don't know if John ever mentioned Animal Farm, which is obviously all well as well, but I think he would have been well on board with that. In Animal Farm, of course, it's based on Stalinism, the Stalinist type of Russian communism. And the idea is that the pigs, they set up a utopia where everyone's equal. But then the famous line is, we're all equal, but some of us are more equal than others. And the pigs turn into the humans at the end. They're indistinguishable from them. Very interesting. And I mean, the fact that the New York Post has to tell everyone that John Lennon was worth 150 million. I mean, who really cares? And arguably, I don't want to put this on the New York Post, but famously there was that article that came out that we know that Mark Chapman read. I'm blanking on the guy's name. It was the one about, I went out to find John Lennon and I found a guy who sells cows and watches daytime TV. I think it was an Esquire article. That seems pretty pointless. I mean, I think the public are conditioned to want to read about rich people. It goes back a bit to what I was saying earlier about, us wanting people that are richer than us and more beautiful than us. I don't know what political stripe that puts me under. I don't really believe in them anyway. I think if you look at what left and right has become, it's so broad that it means basically nothing. But yeah, this obsession with money, and I've just been on the subject of Orwell, who's probably my favourite author, pound for pound. I just listened to the audiobook of Down and Out in Paris and London, which is just fantastic. I'd recommend the audiobook, which you can find online in a dark corner, or the book itself, the print book. I think he says in England, or just in generally in society, and that's back in the 30s, people are judged by their money and their job, not by, to quote Martin Luther King, the content of their character. I'm having to jump around here, sorry folks, I'd like to go more in depth into some of these bits, but I'm going to stop recording in a sec anyway and do a part 2 when I've regained some strength, because I'm flagging here, folks. Anyway, let's just read maybe one more bit here. I think they're still talking about money and possessions. John Lennon says, my insecurity is having too many clothes. That's a physical manifestation of my insecurity. A closet full of clothes I cannot possibly wear. But I understand it. I still have the clothes and I still dump them on the Salvation Army once a year. I understand the neurosis. Having a lot of money is no longer a problem for me. That's why I ended up with more. Yoko didn't have that problem because she was born rich and she was rich all her life. She couldn't understand my attitude about money. Whether we had more or less seemed irrelevant to her. Yoko did come from a rich family, but then they were plunged into scraping around for food when they were evacuated during the war. It's quite a thing for him to admit that. He knows, he was aware of his weaknesses, and I suppose one of his better qualities was, he says, I understand the neurosis, and he was firmly putting himself in that boat. He knew he was highly neurotic, and he obviously knew deep down that by 1980 those things hadn't suddenly gone away, as this oversimplified official narrative likes to tell us they did. So he's admitting he's got loads of clothes that he doesn't need. Again, rather than just sort of ragging on John Lennon for singing Imagine No Possessions, why don't you think about whether you've got more clothes than you need? I'm not calling you out there, just saying to myself as well. I don't have a load of clothes because I realised after a while that decluttering was one of the most healthy things I could do, so I did it, and I've never really accumulated a lot of stuff since then, only books really. The interviewer here does challenge him. This is quite interesting. Why does anyone need $150 million? Couldn't you be perfectly content with 100 million or 1 million? And I don't think he's necessarily talking about only John. He's talking about rich people in general. John says, what would you suggest I do? Give everything away and walk the streets? I wasn't content with no dollars. I wasn't content with 1 million. And I'm not content with 100 million. Contentment doesn't lie in money. The interviewer, then why be in the game of getting more? Because to do what I do, I need what money does. He says, 150 million? This is John. It's all relative, isn't it? And then the interviewer, what about all the talk of transcending possessions? John, you could transcend possessions without walking round in a robe. Possessions can be in the mind. A monk who's off in a cave dreaming about fucking, sucking and eating is in a far worse position than me, who has so-called money in his back pocket. I'm over the conflict that says you can't be awake and have money. That's absolute rubbish. When Christ said it's as easy for a rich man to get to heaven as to go through the eye of a needle, I took it literally that one has to dump possessions to get through to nirvana, or whatever you call it. But an intellectual has less chance of getting through than me. They're possessed of ideas. An intellectual with no money who's living the ascetic life, no TV, well, they're possessed of ideas of what they're supposed to be. I'm no longer possessed of ideas. So those were the possessions I had to get rid of, not the physical possessions. Yes, not sure I buy all that. I mean, that sounds a bit like an excuse to keep accumulating possessions. A monk who's got rid of all his possessions, yes, he could be trapped by his mind, but he's most likely to be meditating, which means that his mind is clear. Having said that, I did a podcast on Life Only about the art of happiness, and it was co-written with the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama was talking about, I don't have a perfect life, I'm still struggling to some extent. Yeah, he hasn't found the answers. But I just don't really buy all that stuff. I think he's being more honest when he said it's part of the neurosis, in fact. Thing about accumulating money, I was, funny enough, to mention my dad again, I was watching football with him yesterday when I went to visit my parents. And I don't follow football at all. I took a sort of passing interest in the World Cup in December. But he was talking about the transfer fees, and Chelsea apparently spent 500 and something million on players in one season. And, you think of 500 million. The first £1 million purchase was made by Brian Clough for Nottingham Forest, and it was buying Trevor Francis. I think it was 1979, so what's that, 44 years ago. And now we're up to whatever the record is for one player, 100 million or whatever it is. I mean, it just means nothing. It may as well be monopoly money. And the fact that money is not backed by anything, it's not backed by gold anymore. It's literally, up to some extent, just figures on a screen. There were some activists that I knew about 10 years ago, and they made a documentary called 97%, because 97% of the money in the British economy is digital. So it's, like I say, figures on a screen. I mean, what does it mean? It's not going to make you any happier, obviously. Most of the studies I've seen, the happiest people in the world are the people who've got just enough. They've got a little bit of financial security, but they're not surrounded by possessions. So I think John was sort of onto something. And again, we're judging him by 1980. If he'd lived, he would have, I'm sure, accumulated lots and lots of ideas. And I think, he felt that he was a work in progress, as I feel, and I think we all should feel. I think it's a healthy thing. We're all evolving, we're all growing every day and every second, arguably. If one of the lessons of John Lennon is to continually be searching for an identity, maybe not a fixed identity, but to be searching around for some sense of your own evolution, I think that's a good thing. And on that positive note, I'm going to bring an end to part one, folks. I'm not sure if this is halfway through. It's almost impossible to judge, really. Not quite halfway through the book, but then we had that long intro. So I'm going to call this the end of part one anyway. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. I think the theme really of this has been ideas, right? And life philosophy. So that's a bit of Yoko's, a bit of John's, and a bit of my own. I'll see you fairly soon for part two of All We Are Saying, the Playboy interviews. And obviously I'll talk about the next show when we've got part two done. So for now, all the best, take care, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.